about the shape of the canon. Now let's talk about the standards for judging what goes in the canon and what doesn't. Canonicity. In a phrase, it comes down to the standard of fidelity to Christ. The church was defensive of its understanding of Jesus Christ through his teachings and through the memories of his apostles. And in the church's first few centuries, there were rival Christianities, just as there are today, with their own claims, their own take on Jesus Christ, and their own rules for behavior. And the church needed a standard to judge who was being faithful to Jesus and who wasn't. This was not an unforeseen problem. Jesus warned of false teachers. Here are some passages in the New Testament where you see signs of these. 1 John 2, "Children, it's the last hour, and as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists, replacement Christs, have come. Therefore we know that it is the last hour." Now listen to these verses. "They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us, but they went out, that it might become plain that they all are not of us." John is referring to rival Christians who have broken fellowship. Or look at Paul writing to the church in Corinth, which he himself founded, and yet he found himself having to fight off the claims of rivals who thought of themselves as superior. "What I'm doing, I will continue to do in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it's no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness." In the book of Revelation, Jesus dictates 7 letters to churches in Asia Minor, and 3 of them mention rivals, people who call themselves apostles and are not, people who hold to the teaching of Balaam, that's figural language, some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans, that woman Jezebel, whoever she is, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants. So 3 out of those 7 letters mention false teachings from rival Christianities. You can see what a problem this is. Jude mentions them, 1 Timothy mentions them, 2 Thessalonians mentions them. Some of these rival Christianities could be pretty radical. You'll run into the school of Gnosticism, which is not agnosticism, Gnosticism, a lot this semester. One Gnostic teacher, Marcion, in the 2nd century, became famous for teaching that the God of the Old Testament was actually not the God of Jesus Christ, but an inferior creator God and an evil one, whom the God of Jesus had sent to overthrow. Now, you can't really reconcile that with the full Bible of Old and New Testaments. So Marcion rejected the Old Testament, and he rejected most of the New Testament. In fact, it's easier to list what he kept in his scriptures than it is to talk about what he took out. He left in parts of the Gospel of Luke, and he left in the letters of Paul. The church rejected Marcion, hands down. In fact, he had made a sizable donation to the church in Rome, and they gave the money back and said, "We don't want it." This is in 144 AD. By the way, file that date away. This tells you that already in the first half of the 2nd century, there are 4 Gospels that are widely respected. There's a canon, there's a functional canon of Scripture, and Marcion is trying to revise it. There is a kind of church consensus already in the early 2nd century about which Gospels are genuine. And so they know to reject Marcion. This pressed the question, which of these proliferating varieties of Christianity are legitimate? And by what standard do you make that determination? The way that the church approached the problem was by standardizing. They standardized their scriptures, they standardized their church structures, and they standardized their statements of faith, all at the same time. We're only going to look at the way that the church standardized the Holy Scriptures. As I've mentioned, their standard was faithfulness to the already familiar traditions of Jesus and his apostles. These were well known in the major churches of the Roman Empire, and so it was pretty easy to tell the fakes from the real thing. The authorities with the most respected voices in the canonizing process were the leaders of churches in the major cities, churches that had been founded by the real apostles. But another force that's a little less appreciated is just precedent. What Christians had been doing in the churches was already authoritative, and when something new came along, something innovative, it faced the burden of proof. Other authorities are prestigious theologians. You'll see the names below of Athanasius, Augustine, Jerome, and bishops, of course. A bishop just means a supervisor of all the churches in a given city. And this was a prestigious position, and it was one that leaders took with great seriousness. Not all of them, but bishops on the whole. So I'm going to go into some historical detail about these authorities and their judgments. Probably more detail than you're that interested in, but history is in the details. And this history might be new to you. I want you to see that the early church is not a black box. It's not something that we don't know anything about. And so conspiracy theories about what the church did in these first few decades of its life, conspiracy theories might sell books and blockbuster movies, but they're out of place. You can actually look at the history of the 2nd century church and the 3rd century church and see these decisions being made on a rather sound basis. As I've said, Holy Scripture was preached. It was read in church. It was commented on by bishops and by teachers. And it was used for teaching and training. It was used for authoritative teaching and training. The Muratorian fragment, recovered pretty recently and dated between 170 and 200, is the earliest list of authoritative scriptures that we have. Now, as I've already mentioned, Marcion came up against an informal consensus about what Gospels and what letters and both testaments belonging in the church. But this is a formal list that includes details. It's just a fragment, so we don't have the beginning, but you can pretty much gather the beginning. It leads off with the 3rd book of the Gospel is the one according to Luke. The 4th is that of John. And then there are the Acts of the Apostles. So we have 4 Gospels and Acts. The epistles of Paul, Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians. And he goes on and says, and there's a second one to the Corinthians, and a second one to the Thessalonians. And then there's the Apocalypse, where John writes to 7 churches. Paul also wrote Philemon, a letter to Titus, 2 letters to Timothy, and these are held sacred in the esteem of the Church Catholic, or the Universal Church. Now look at what I've highlighted in red here. There is current also an epistle to the Laodiceans, and one to the Alexandrians, forged in Paul's name, to further the heresy of Marcion, and several others which can't be received into the universal church, for it's not fitting that gall be mixed with honey. So here you have evidence of the sifting process already underway in the 2nd century between legitimate and illegitimate writings. Then the writer goes on to more of our New Testament, an epistle from Jude, 2 letters of John. He seems not to be aware of all 3 letters of John that we have in our New Testaments. The book of Wisdom, that's part of the Greek Old Testament, so I've put that in yellow. And then listen, this is interesting stuff. We receive only the apocalypses of John and Peter, though some of us are not willing that the latter be read in church. You have universal respect for John's apocalypse, which is the book of Revelation, and you have uneven support for the apocalypse of Peter. Now, highlighted in yellow are writings that were popular but didn't make it into the canon. Hermas wrote The Shepherd very recently, in our times, in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the Church of the city of Rome. So it ought to be read, but it can't be read publicly to the people in church, either among the prophets, whose number is complete, or among the apostles, for it is after their time. So we have later writings that are respected and well used, but not read in church along with the apostles or the prophets. Then, in red at the bottom, we accept nothing whatsoever of Arsenius or Valentinus or Miltiades, who also composed a new book of Psalms for Marcion. So this is a really rich snapshot of the canonization process already underway, where there's actually a pretty settled core, and there are some writings at the periphery. Let me remind you of that star cluster that I showed you earlier. You can see which books are in the center, uncontested, and you can see which ones are out on the fringes, less universally respected. It's those books that are going to be the focus of the canonization process, not the ones in the center. Everyone already agrees about those. So, genuine scripture is to be read in church among and along with the prophets, that means the Old Testament, and the apostles, the New Testament. In the 140s, the church rejected Marcion's truncated canon and his truncated God, a God that wasn't big enough to hold the Old Testament. Not only was there a need to preserve what people like Marcion wanted to exclude, there was a need to exclude writings that people wanted to include. Montanists practiced charismatic gifts like prophecy, words of knowledge, and the like. And they regarded those prophecies as having the same status as Scripture. And the church drew a line there and said, no, this doesn't date back to the original apostles and their memories, so even if it's legitimate, it's not canonical. Even if it's from God, it is not our standard by which we will judge everything from God. So think of the canon as a kind of gold standard or a yardstick by which other things, which are good things, are measured. Church leaders continued to make lists of canonical scriptures. It wasn't that everything was contested. I think they were weighing in on the debates of the day about the margins, about the stars on the outside of that cluster. A good source for you, if you are really interested in following up on this, is by Edmund Gallagher and John Mead. It's called The Biblical Canon Lists from Early Christianity. Let's look at a couple of those lists. Eusebius was a church historian in the first few centuries, and he was writing about a fellow leader of the church, Origen of Alexandria. Origen wrote a commentary on Psalm 1, and in that commentary, Eusebius says he gives a catalog of the sacred scriptures of the Old Testament and then the New Testament. The 22 books of the Hebrews are the following, and this will sound pretty familiar to you. He gives first the Greek name and then the Hebrew name. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. 1st and 2nd Kings, which we today call 1st and 2nd Samuel. 3rd and 4th Kings, which we call 1st and 2nd Kings. Chronicles, actually 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And then Esdras. I put this in blue because it's not in Protestant Old Testaments, although Ezra and Nehemiah, which could be included there, were. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Isaiah, Jeremiah with Lamentations. Those are 2 books for us. Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Job, Esther. And then another Old Testament book that Protestants don't have in our copies, the Maccabees. Then Origen goes on to the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, the Gospel of John, the letters or epistles of the apostles. Paul, Peter. This is interesting. Peter has left one acknowledged letter, perhaps also a second, but this is doubtful. When we cover 2 Peter, you'll notice that it has indications that it comes at a much later date. 2 Peter is having a harder time being accepted in the churches than 1 Peter. The Apocalypse of John, or Revelation, he has left also an epistle of very few lines, perhaps also a 2nd and 3rd, but not all consider them genuine. Together, they don't contain 100 lines, so he says, it's kind of a minor thing. And then the letter to the Hebrews, which is written in a different style than Paul's. Its diction is pure Greek. If I give my opinion, I should say that the thoughts are those of the apostle, but the diction and phraseology are those of someone who remembered the apostolic teachings. So if any church holds that this epistle is by Paul, let it be commended for this. For not without reason have the ancients handed it down as Paul's. But who wrote the epistle? In truth, God knows. Some people think Clement wrote it. Some people think Luke wrote it. So Origen in the 3rd century is actually giving us a kind of critical commentary on which books are in the Old Testament and New Testament, and especially weighing in on some of the debates in the churches about those letters on the fringe. Another influential list of scriptures comes from Athanasius, an immensely influential theologian in the early 4th century. Here's a letter from Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, of the Old Testament, 22 books in number. We're not going to go through this all over again. Athanasius goes on. This is in 363, and this list of the New Testament writings is the first one that completely matches ours today. 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then the Acts of the Apostles. And the 7 general letters, also called Catholic. Catholic means universal or general. What that means is that they aren't addressed to specific churches. They're addressed to a general audience. James, 2 of Peter, 3 of John, Jude. 2 Peter is accepted. All 3 letters of John are accepted now. Then 14 letters of Paul. Usually we think of 13, but he includes Hebrews as having been written by Paul. Then the Apocalypse of John, the Revelation of John. He says, these are fountains of salvation, that they who thirst may be satisfied with the living words they contain. In these alone is proclaimed the doctrine of godliness. Let no one add to these, neither let anyone take aught from these. Those are 2 of the more important lists. There are so many more. Canon number 60 of the Council of Laodicea in 363, which may or may not be genuine. Jerome's letter in 394. Augustine's book on Christian doctrine in 395. Church councils and individual bishops continued to issue lists of approved scriptures for the next 50 years. Again, tampering with the edges, not the core. We're talking about which stars are on the very outside of the cluster. You might think about the debate over whether Pluto is a planet or a planetoid. It's the same kind of thing. It's not going to change whether Jupiter belongs in the solar system. The last planetoids, you might say, to be accepted were Hebrews, which was accepted in the East, but less popular in the Western Roman Empire, the Latin-speaking part, and Revelation, which was popular in the West, but which had a harder time being accepted in the Greek-speaking East. Eventually, though, you can see from these lists, they're widely enough accepted, even if they're debated. They don't seem to have uphill battles to win. They just seem to have a harder time achieving a consensus position, but they're already widely respected. You can see it in the lists that we've read already. There's a detail that we're not going to worry too much about in New Testament, and that is the Greek Old Testament books that are part of the Greek lists, but not part of the Jewish Tanakh. They became a particularly divisive issue in the Reformation, when Protestants broadly went with the Hebrew canon, and Catholics and Orthodox broadly continue to go with the Greek canon. One last detail about the canonization process. The spread of the church over these centuries generated a huge body of texts of New Testament writings. All of this work by these churches, far-flung, even using different languages, produced an immense textual tradition for New Testament texts in Greek, which is unsurpassed in the ancient world for both its quality and its quantity. Scribes were copying these manuscripts. They did it by hand, of course, and these introduced a few errors along the way. Scribes would also sometimes gloss or add a few words to the texts for explanation. Scholars have to go back and try to identify what those are and clean up the text. And today, our Old and New Testaments reflect the results of that cleanup process. We have really pretty clean copies of the Greek New Testament and both the Hebrew and the Greek Old Testament for our translations. That's why the Bible's not a translation of a translation of a translation, and why a lot of the textual problems that crept in, even though they weren't huge, are really not even issues now. And we're in a great position even to know about them because of the size and the sprawling nature of this text tradition.